Hey everyone, what's going on? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 80, Daf Pei of Masechta Pesachim. It's kind of snowy over here in New Jersey. FYI. Today we're studying Daf Pei. So, yeah, what does Daf Pei talk about? Who could tell me? Different configurations of tumas, like the whole 50-50 kind of, that kind of stuff, but other configurations of that. Yeah, pretty exciting. We'll get there. Zrikas Adam Betuma. We get to a new Mishnah. And also Tumas HaTehom. Sounds pretty dramatic, but I think it just means Suffolk Tumah. But why call it Suffolk Tumah if you can call it Tumas HaTehom? Tumah of the abyss. That sounds more exciting. Alright, we're going to start on Daf Ayin Tesamud Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. Gufa. We had said earlier, so remember yesterday, who could remind me what we were talking about yesterday? We had a machlokus between Rav and Rav Kahana about what happens when 50% of Am Yisrael is Tahor and 50% of Am Yisrael is Tameh. Rav had said, well, in such a case, the Tameh people bring the Korban Pesach b'tumah, and the Tahor people bring the Korban Pesach b'tara. Which of course is as opposed to when the majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh, in which case everybody brings the Korban Pesach b'tumah. Or if the majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh, everybody just brings it b'tumah, even the Tahor people. Okay. Now, Rav Kahana had said that if, in this case, so the Tahor people bring the Korban Pesach b'tara, then there were 2 different opinions about what the Tameh people do. One opinion was that you wait till they do Pesach Sheni. The other opinion is that they don't do anything at all. Fine. Now, we had brought 3 brises yesterday. One to support each one, which on the surface of things sounds like it would be supporting each one of those 3 opinions. To now expand upon the brisa that was brought that most directly resembles Rav's opinion, which is that when you have 50-50, the Torah people do the Korban Pesach b'tara and the Tameh people do the Korban Pesach b'tumah, we are now going to expand and open up that brisa. So Gufa, we had said earlier, so what do you do when Am Yisrael is 50% Torah and 50% Tameh? So the Torah people bring the Korban Pesach b'tara, and the Tameh people bring the Korban Pesach b'tumah. If there were more Tameh people than Torah people, even just by one person, Yasu b'tumah, so then, well, that's a majority of Tameh people, and now everybody just brings the Korban Pesach b'tumah. Lefi she'ein Korban Tzibur Chaluk, and this is a concept that's going to come up a little bit today. Lefi she'ein Korban Tzibur Chaluk, because we don't have a divisive Korban Tzibur, and therefore, when the majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh, everybody brings the Korban Pesach b'tumah, meaning the Torah people, they don't have to be concerned that the Korban Pesach remains Tahor. No, you don't want to, as Rashi explains a little bit later, we don't want to have a situation where we have people being careful from other people and being scared of other people and being like, I guess kind of like we have now with the corona, right? Everyone's nervous. I don't want to go near you. Don't breathe on me. We don't, that's not ideal, right? So in Korban Tzibur Chaluk, when it comes to Korban Tzibur, so like a Korban Pesach, for example, we don't want, these people are doing it b'tumah, these people are doing it b'tara, and they don't want to go near the people doing it b'tumah, because then maybe their Korban Pesach will become Tameh. We don't want that. If the majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh, then everybody does the Korban Pesach b'tumah. And we're not concerned, even the Torah people aren't going to be trying to stay away from the Tameh people to make sure that their Korban Pesach remains Tahor. No, everyone does it b'tumah. Fine. We're going to see how this rule plays out a little bit. Rabbi Eliezer ben Masya Omer says, Rabbi Eliezer ben Masya Eina Yochid Machriyas Atzibur L'tumah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Masya says you're going to have more than a majority of simply one person. Shneimar, as the pasuk says, Lo sucha lizbach es haposach be'achad sharecha. Right? Do not slaughter the Korban Pesach in one of your gates, but meaning to sort of make a drush on the word be'achad, that you're not going to just have one person determine the details of the Korban Pesach, and therefore the majority of one will not be enough in order to determine a majority of Tameh people to bring the Korban Pesach b'tumah. You're going to have at least a majority of 2. Sounds exciting. Reb Shimon Omer, afilu shevet echad Tameh u'shar kol shvatim ta'orim halal osin la'atzman v'halal osin la'atzman. So says Reb Shimon that if you have all of Am Yisrael, 12 shvatim, now even if just one shevet is Tameh, well, that shevet will bring the Korban Pesach b'tumah, and everybody else will bring the Korban Pesach b'tara. Interesting. Right, so let's read that again. Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon, afilu shevet echad tameh, if you have one shevet that is tameh, let's say shevet Ruven, ushar kol shvatim tuorim, and all of the other shvatim are tahor, halalo osan atzman, valalo osan atzman. So the tameh shevet, Ruven in our example, will bring the Korban Pesach b'tumah, and all the other shvatim will bring the Korban Pesach b'tara. My time, how come? My time to Reb Shimon, because he holds shevet echad ikre kahal. Because Reb Shimon says that one shevet is already considered a kahal. Rashi says because, right, that the Eibishter says to Yaakov Avinu, goy ukal goyim yiyeh mimeka, that a nation and a kahal of nations will be from you. And at that point, only one shevet was yet to be born. That was Binyamin. And therefore, so we see that one shevet is already called a kahal. And as our Mishnah said, nitma kahal, o rubo, etc. So you can bring it b'tumah. And therefore, Reb Shimon says, if one shevet is tamei, they bring the Korban Pesach b'tumah, and everybody else brings the Korban Pesach b'tara. Let's see what Reb Yehuda has to say. Where is Reb Yehuda? Here he is. Reb Yehuda, Omer says, Reb Yehuda, listen to this. It's a very interesting opinion. Afilu shevet echad tamei, ushar kol shvatim torin. Even if you only have one shevet that's tamei, and all the rest of the shvatim are tahor, yaisu b'tumah. Nonetheless, everyone's just going to bring the Korban Pesach b'tumah. How come? Shein Korban Tzibur Chaluk, because of this concept that we mentioned briefly earlier, Shein Korban Tzibur Chaluk, that we do not have a divisive Korban Tzibur. Rabbi Yehuda holds Shevet Echad Ikri Kahal, that one Shevet is already called a Kahal, V'avilu Palga Ufalga, and therefore we treat it as 50-50, Vein Korban Tzibur Chaluk, and we don't want to have a divisive Korban Tzibur of the Kula B'tumah, and therefore everyone does a B'tumah. So the way I understand it, and I learned this with a friend of mine the other day. So we looked it up in the art school. They didn't say it explicitly, but I don't know. I assume that what they're getting at over here is the principle that I feel like we've seen before, maybe at least once. The principle of kol kavua k'mechza mechza dami. That whenever you have something specific, yeah, we had it actually earlier in Pesachim with like the meat, and if you find meat in Rosh Hashanah, there's 10 meat stores, like that whole thing. Anyways, so the concept of kol kavua k'mechza mechza dami, that when you have something that is set, that is fixed, so then it's as if it's 50%. And therefore, what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is that if you have one kahal, one shevet, and a shevet is called a kahal, is tameh, and that's already enough to be considered one unit, so now we'll treat it as though 50% of Am Yisrael is tameh. And Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, therefore, seems to be that if you have 50-50, so then everyone will just do a b'tumah. Right? Because ein korban tzibur chaluk, that you're not going to have a divisive Korban Tzibur. We're going to have these people are concerned to keep it tameh. Well, these people don't care because they're tameh anyways. These people are tahor. It's funny, right? It's so funny how you could see it in our days with current events. Just this whole Corona thing. Everybody concerned about getting infected from other people, and then there's like interesting things. Well, these people already had it, so maybe then they're not as concerned as other people. Already, it's funny you see it like in the context of the Korban Pesach. Like, well, they're tameh anyways. They don't care. We're tahor. We want our Korban Pesach to remain tahor. We have to stay away from them. And we don't want that when it comes to Korban Pesach. Anyways, let's go weiter in Shas. Itmar, it was stated, you saw mechza tahor and mechza tmein. Alright, so if you have half of Am Yisrael's tahor, half of Am Yisrael's tameh. Omer Rav, says Rav, metamen echod mein b'sheretz. Interesting. So, just, all you gotta do is just throw a dead mouse at somebody and make them tameh. And then then they'll tip the scales. So you have 50% tameh, 50% tar. Just throw a dead mouse or a dead rat or a dead weasel, some dead, disgusting thing that you wouldn't want thrown at you. So unlike Rav Nachman, who said the other day about v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, that kill somebody in the way that you would like to be killed, that seems to go out the window. Take a dead rat, throw it at somebody, and make them tameh. And now that just tipped the scales. Okay. So, the question, the Gemara wants to know why. Why do you have to do that? Why not just do, after all, who's saying this? Rav is saying this. Rav's opinion, he told us what his opinion is on the matter. When you have 50% tar, 50% tameh, the tar people do the Korban Pesach b'tara, the tameh people do the Korban Pesach b'tumah. So we know what to do in the case. Why do we have to tip the scales? The Amarav, because Rav said, we know what to do when it's 50-50. The Torah people do it b'tara, the tumah people do it b'tumah. So Amrei, so they answer, Hachab ma'eskinon. Here, what are we talking about? Okay, the Gemara wants to say that for some reason, what it's talking about here is that there was one more Tameh person than there was Tahor people, and that seems to make a difference for some reason. That because there was one more person who was Tameh than Tahor, that's why you have to throw a dead rat at somebody to make it two people who are Tameh. If that's the case, well, if that's the case, if there's one more Tameh person than Tahor person, well then the majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh. Ne'abdu kula b'tumah. And if that's the case, then we know what to do when everybody's Tameh. Just bring the Korban Pesach b'tumah. Why do you have to throw a dead rat at somebody? So the Gemara wants to suggest, well, maybe Rav holds like Rabbi Eliezer ben Masya, the Amr Eina Yachid Machrias Atzibur L'tumah, who says that a majority of one is not enough to make it considered as though everybody is Tameh, and therefore we want to throw a dead rat at somebody so that there will be two people who are Tameh, and one person who is very unhappy because he had a dead rat thrown at him and he didn't want a dead rat thrown at him. If that's the case, well, if we hold like Rabbi Eliezer ben Masya, that a majority of one is not enough to be considered a majority, well then, okay, so if it's not a majority, then it's just considered like half and half. In which case, well then just if it's half and half, we know what to do. Have the Torah people bring the Korban Pesach b'tara, and the Tameh people bring the Korban Pesach b'tumah. Elachi kamar. So, what's the deal? Why is Rav suggesting that we throw a dead rat at somebody? So, I'ika Tana, to Sarvala Kitana Kama, because what he's saying is that, well, if we have a Tana who holds like the Tana Kama, who says that when you have 50% Torah and 50% Tameh, well then the Torah people do the Korban Pesach b'tara and the Tameh people do the Korban Pesach b'tumah. But at the same time, he also wants to hold Rabbi Yehuda the Amr in Korban Tzibur Chaluk, who says that, well, we don't want a Korban Tzibur Chaluk, so what do you do in this case? On the one hand, you have 50% of Am Yisrael is Tameh, 50% of Am Yisrael is Tahor. And the halacha in this case is that the Torah people do it b'tara and the Tameh people do it b'tumah, but at the same time, what about Ein Korban Tzibur Chaluk? We don't want to have divisiveness in the Korban Tzibur. So what do we do in this case? So what you do is you throw a dead sheretz at somebody, and now there's one more Tameh person than Torah people. So then everyone will just do the same thing, which is bring the Korban Pesach b'tumah. So matamen echad me'em b'sheretz, you throw a dead sheretz at one of them, and then run away quickly before he sees that it was you. Let's go weiter. Ve'ula amar, and says Ula, mishalchen echad me'en l'derech v'cholka. So Ula's suggestion is that when you have 50% Torah and 50% Tameh, just send one guy, what do we say? Send him packing? Pack his bags? Pack his bags. We say to one fellow, hey fellow, pack your bags. And by him leaving, so then there'll be a difference of one, right? And then I guess if he's Tahor, so then there'll be more Tameh people. If he's Tameh, then there'll be more Tahor people, I guess. Now, say, Ula, why do you have to send him away? Why not just throw a dead sheretz at him? What's wrong with that? And then there'll be a majority of Tameh people, and you'll just bring the Korban Pesach b'tumah. So Ksava shochtem v'zorken al Tameh sheretz. Well, Ula's opinion is that throwing a dead sheretz at somebody is not enough, because if somebody is Tameh tumas sheretz, you would still be allowed to include him in the Korban Pesach, and therefore throwing a dead sheretz at him isn't really going to make a difference anyways. So v'tamenu b'meis. So why don't you throw a dead body at him? Okay, we're up in the ante over here. Yikes. So, or at least a kazayas, right? Maybe just take like an olive's worth of flesh from a dead body and throw it at him. Bimatamiyim b'maga. So Ula, so why are you saying that we have to send him away? Why not just throw a kazayas basar mibisar ames at the fellow and then make him tameh? So well, if you make him tameh tumas ames, well now he's not going to be able to bring a korban chagiga. And we want him to be able to bring a korban chagiga. To which the Gemara says, yeah, but Ula, by sending this fellow away, now he's not going to be able to bring the korban pesach. He's out of town. Efshar davar b'sheni. To which Ula says, yeah, but he could always bring the pesach sheni. To which they respond, Yeah, but b'meis nami efshar David b'shvi davel eshmini shelo. To which they respond to Ula, yeah, but what's wrong with just throwing some corpse at the guy? So it'll be matami tumas hameis. So he won't be able to bring the korban Pesach, the korban chagiga the next day, but he's gonna. Day 1 is erev Pesach of his tumah. Day 7 is therefore the last day of day 7 of his tumah is also the last day of Pesach. At that point, he's already. Well, day 7 is the 6th day of Pesach, which means by the last day of Pesach, he's already tahor. In which case, he could bring the korban chagiga on the last day of Pesach, because korban chagiga is tashlum and kol shiva. If you didn't bring it on the first day, you could bring it on the other days. So Ksav Ula, while Ula holds kulu tashlumin derisho ninu, that Ula holds that the way that tashlumin works, the way that it works to make up the korban chagiga, if you didn't bring it on day 1, you can bring it the other days, is that you're making up day 1. Meaning it's not that each day is its own sort of separate opportunity to bring a korban chagiga. No, it's that each day is an opportunity to make up for having not brought it on the first day. And therefore, the chazi b'rishon, chazi b'chulu. Therefore, if on day 1, you're fit to bring the korban chagiga, and for whatever reason you didn't bring it, so you can bring it any of the other days. But v'cholecha de lo chazi b'rishon, lo chazi b'chulu. But if on day 1, you were unfit to bring the korban chagiga, because in this case, you were tami tumas hameis, well then, on the last day of Pesach, you will be unable to bring the korban chagiga, because you were unfit to bring it on day 1, so therefore you can't bring it at all. You can't do tashlumin. So therefore, Ula's suggestion is tell the fellow to pack his bags and leave town, and by doing so, there will be one less person on one of the sides, either the tummy side or the Torah side. Amlu Rav Nachman said to them, Zilu v'amru le'ula, go and tell Ula, matzais the akar siche u'mashkene v'rayit. Who in the world is going to listen to you to just pick up his tent and all of his stuff and leave town? He just slept all the way to Jerusalem in order, for Pesach, and now you're telling him, go away? We need somebody to leave. Who's going to want to do that? So therefore Ula says, Rav Nachman says that Ula's suggestion is not very practical. Which is funny, because remember I feel like Ula and Rav Nachman have a funny relationship ever since Ula came over to Rav Nachman's house and caused Rav Nachman's wife to break all of his 400 barrels of wine. I feel like maybe their relationship was tarnished a shtickle. Idmar was stated, Ruban Zavin Mutant Tmei Mesim. Sounds like between a rock and a hard place. The majority of Am Yisrael was Zavin. Doesn't sound fun. And the minority of Am Yisrael were Tmei Mes. Doesn't sound fun either. Which would you rather be, a Zav or a Tmei Mes? Tmei Mes for sure, right? I feel like Zav just seems like awkward. Let's go weiter. Amar Rav. So what do you do? So you have the majority of Am Yisrael Zavin. Now, when it comes to doing the Korban Pesach B'tumah, of course we all know that that's a majority of Am Yisrael being Tmei Mes. If the majority of Am Yisrael is Zavs, well, they don't do the Korban Pesach B'tumah. Now, they're also not going to do Pesach Sheni, because only individuals do Pesach Sheni, as we know. The majority of Am Yisrael doesn't do Pesach Sheni. Okay. So, but in terms of Tmei Mesim, so if the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Mes, so they do the Pesach Rishon. If a minority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Mes, so then they do Pesach Sheni. So now, listen up. So Idmar was stated, if the majority of Am Yisrael was Zavs, and the minority was Tmei Mes. So Amarav, Osen Tmei Mesim, Einan Osen Lo Barishon V'Lo B'Sheni. Interesting. So those Tmei Mesim are not going to do Pesach Rishon or Pesach Sheni. Barishon Lo Avde, they're not going to do Pesach Rishon, Davu Miuto Lo Avde Barishon. Well, because it's a minority of Tmei Mes, and a minority of Tamei people don't do Pesach Rishon, they do Pesach Sheni. B'Sheni Nami Lo Avde, but in this case they're also not going to do Pesach Sheni either, because Kol Echad Avde Tzibur B'Rishon Avid Yachid B'Sheni. Kol Echad Lo Avde Tzibur B'Rishon Lo Avid Yachid B'Sheni. Let's read that again. Because Kol Echad Avde Tzibur B'Rishon, that only in cases where the congregation brought the Korban Pesach initially, well then Avid Yachid B'Sheni. If somebody for whatever reason was unable to do Pesach Rishon, so he could do Pesach Sheni. But Kol Echad Lo Avde Tzibur B'Rishon, but in a case where the Tzibur is not doing the Pesach Rishon, such as over here where the majority of Am Yisrael is Zavim, so they're not doing Pesach Rishon, well then Lo Avid Yachid B'Sheni, well then they don't do Pesach Sheni either. In order to do Pesach Sheni, there would have had to have been a Pesach Rishon. But in this case, where there was no Pesach Rishon, because the majority of Am Yisrael was Zavs, so then even the minority of Tmei Mesim do not do Pesach Sheni either. So it sounds like in this year, there wouldn't be any Korban Pesach Bichlal, to which Shmuel says, Shmuel said to them, Zilu Amr le Abba, go and tell Abba. As Rashi in Brachas pointed out, that Shmuel would call Rav Abba out of Kavod. V'yasu b'nei Yisrael sapasach b'moado, ma'avadet le. So Shmuel says to Rav, but what about the pasuk that says that the Yidden are going to bring the Korban Pesach? Meaning, Rav, you basically just canceled the Korban Pesach this year. The majority of Am Yisrael is Zavs, the minority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Meis, and you're saying that nobody's going to do Korban Pesach bichlal, not Pesach Rishon, not Pesach Sheni. Shmuel says, what about the pasuk that talks about Bnei Yisrael offering a Korban Pesach? It's cancelled. So Rav said to them, well, Zilu Amrulei, go and tell Shmuel, Ki avu kulu zavin ma'avadet le. Well, let me ask you a question, Shmuel. What if all of Am Yisrael was Zavs? What would you do? Elikeven de lo efsher, lo efsher. Hachanami, lo efsher. You would say, Shmuel, I assume, that if all of Am Yisrael was Zavs, well then, there would be no Korban Pesach that year, because the majority of Am Yisrael being Zavs, they wouldn't bring the Pesach Rishon, and because everyone's a Zav, so there's nobody who would do it Pesach Sheni either. There would be no Korban Pesach that year. So in this case also, says Rav, when the majority is Zavim and they're not going to do Pesach Rishon, and the minority is Tmei Mesim, they're not going to do Pesach Rishon because they're a minority, but also they're not going to do Pesach Sheni because there was no Pesach Rishon. That year, there won't be any Korban Pesach. What do you want me to tell you? Although the good news is that it sounds pretty theoretical, I imagine, so I assume that in practice, the Korban Pesach hopefully will never be cancelled. Well, I guess it's kind of cancelled now, right? Right? I guess. Alright. Well, hopefully we'll do it again soon. And Diana, hopefully we'll have to make some arrangement for the vegan chevre. Well, we said that you don't actually have to necessarily eat it, right? You just have to be fit to eat it. Let's go weiter. Itmar. It was stated, Ruben Tmei Mesim, Umuton Zovin. Alright, also sounds like fun times. So you have the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Meis. Okay, so if the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Mesim, so they're going to do Pesach Rishon B'tumah. Umuton Zovin. And the minority is Zovin. Now, as we learned, even when the Korban Pesach is brought B'tumah, because the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Meis, Zovin do not bring the Korban Pesach with them. So they're going to have to, in general, they would do Pesach Sheni. Rav Huna Amar Ein Tashlum the Pesach Haba B'tumah. Rav Huna, however, says that there's no Pesach Sheni on years where the Pesach was brought B'tumah. So if the majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh and they do Pesach Rishon B'tumah, so then Pesach Sheni is cancelled that year. And therefore this Zav minority is not going to do Pesach Sheni. Rav Ada bar Ahava Amar Yesh Tashlum the Pesach Haba B'tumah. Whereas Rav Ada bar Ahava says that there is Tashlumin, there is Pesach Sheni, even when the Pesach Rishon was brought B'tumah, and therefore the Zavs would bring the Pesach Sheni. Name Abaka Miflage. So let's say that the machlokas between Rav Huna and Rav Ada bar Ahava is the following. That Rav Huna, who says that there's no Pesach Sheni when the Pesach is brought B'tumah, when the Korban Pesach is B'tumah, well, because Rav Huna holds that Tumah Dechuya Hi B'tzibur. And therefore, since the Pesach Rishon is brought B'tumah, so there's not going to be any Pesach Sheni that year. Whereas Rav Ada bar Ahava, who says that there is Tashlum for Pesach Haba B'tumah, that Rav Ada bar Ahava holds that Tumah Hutra B'tzibur. And therefore, when the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Meis, so they bring the Korban Pesach, because he says Tumah Hutra B'tzibur, and therefore, since the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Meis, so Tumah is basically cancelled. It's like every other year for all intents and purposes. They brought the Korban Pesach, and now the Zavin can do Pesach Sheni. Whereas Rav Huna says, no, when the majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh, it's not a free pass. Tumah is still there. They're bringing it B'tumah, and because they're bringing the Korban Pesach B'tumah, well then there's not going to be Korban Pesach. There's not going to be Pesach Sheni that year. Amri, they say, lo, that's not the way to explain it to Chuli. Amma Tumah D'chuya B'tzibur. Everyone agrees Tumah D'chuya B'tzibur. Uva Plige, this is the Machlokas Marsavar. Tara Midachya tumah lo midachya, u'marsavar afilu tumah nami midachya. It's just simply an explanation. It's simply machlokas about Pesach Sheni. When the Pesach Rishon was brought bituma, can you have a Pesach Sheni, right? Tara midachya, tumah lo midachya. That Rav Huna's opinion is that, well, when the Pesach Harishon is brought b'tara, so then the Tamei people get pushed off to Pesach Sheni. But if the Korban Pesach is brought b'tara, then but if the Korban Pesach is brought b'tuma, so then the Tamei people at the time do not get pushed off to Pesach Sheni. Right, meaning the Tamei people who were unable to bring it betuma with the Tmei Mesim who would bring it betuma, they do not get pushed off to Pesach Sheni, says Rav Huna. Whereas Rav Ada bar Hava says, Umar Savar, Afilu Tumanami Midachya, that even if the Pesach Rishon is brought betuma, the Tamei people who were unable to bring it betuma because they're Zavs or Mitzoras or whatever, they're still able to bring the Pesach Sheni. That is the machlokas between Rav Huna and Rav Ada bar Hava. Itmar, who stated, Ayu Shlishisan Zavin, Ushlishisan Tohorin, Ushlishisan Tmei Mesim. Fun times. A third of Am Yisrael was Zavs, a third of Am Yisrael was Tar, and a third of Am Yisrael was Tmei Meis. Okay? Amar Reb Mani bar Patish, Osan Tmei Mesim, Einen Osan Loas HaRishon V'Loas HaSheni. So it says Reb Mani bar Patish that the Tmei Mesim fall through the cracks. They're not going to do Pesach Rishon, nor are they going to do Pesach Sheni. How come? But Rishon Lo Avdei, they're not going to do Pesach Rishon, because Higdilu Zavin Ala Torin, to Lo Avdei B'Tumah. Havle Tmei Mesim, Miuta, Miuta Lo Avdei B'Rishon. Let's read that again. So it says, Mani bar Patish finds they fall through the cracks. So B'Rishon Lo Avdei, the Tmei Mesim, who are 1/3 of Am Yisrael, they're not going to bring the Pesach Rishon. How come? Well, because Igdilu Zavin Ala Tohorim, to Lo Avdei B'Tumah. Right? That Zavin do not bring the Korban Pesach B'Tumah, right? Even as we saw a few minutes ago, if the majority of Am Yisrael is Zavin, then they don't bring the Korban Pesach B'Tumah. And therefore, you cannot add them onto the Tmei Mesim to consider it as though 2/3 of Am Yisrael is Tameh. No, that's irrelevant. And therefore, the Zavin are going to join together with the Tahorim, i.e. people are not going to be doing the Korban Pesach B'Tumah. And therefore, Havale Tmei Mesim Mi'uta. And therefore, Tmei Mesim is 1/3 as compared to the 2/3 of Zavin and Tahorim. U'miuta lo avde b'rishon, and a miut of Tmei Meis will not do the Pesach Rishon, and therefore, so they're not going to bring the Korban Pesach. B'sheni lo avde, but they're also not going to do the Korban. They're also not going to bring the Pesach Sheni because nitzifu Zavanim Tmei Mesim. Well, because who brings the Pesach Sheni? Zavin bring the Pesach Sheni. Tmei Mesim bring the Pesach Sheni. So then when it comes to the Pesach Sheni, we join together the Zavin and the Tmei Mesim, in which case, it's going to be 2/3 of Am Yisrael bringing the Pesach Sheni. Right? To Lav de Rishon, that neither the, right, the Zavin don't do Pesach Rishon, and therefore they're going to join together with the Tmei Mesim for the Pesach Sheni. Avalu Ruba lo matchul Pesach Sheni, and therefore the Zavin plus the Tmei Mesim are going to be 2/3 of Am Yisrael, and the majority of Am Yisrael does not do Pesach Sheni, only a minority, and therefore the Tmei Mesim are not going to, they're going to basically fall through the cracks, not do any Korban Pesach that year, although it sounds like the Zavin also are going to fall through the cracks, because they're not going to do the Pesach Rishon or the Pesach Sheni either. So I guess the only people doing Korban Pesach that year would be the Torah people. Alrighty, new Mishnah. HaPesach shenizrak damo v'achar kach noda shu tamei. HaTzitz miratze. Haha, you thought we were done with tzitz miratze. Think again. So, the Pesach shenizrak damo. So the Korban Pesach, that the blood was already thrown onto the Mizbeach. V'achar kach noda shu tamei. And then it turns out that the blood or the Korban was tamei. Right? So, you brought your Korban Pesach, you thought all was good, and then you find out after the fact, after the Zrikas Adam, that in fact the blood or the meat was tameh. Hatzitz miratze, don't worry about it, the tzitz will fix that for you. Nitma haguf in a tzitz miratze. However, if you find out that you're tameh, that you yourself are tameh after the fact, well then the tzitz is not miratze on that. Because they say that a nazir, a fellow who decides that he's not going to drink wine, he's not going to cut his hair, he's not going to become tamei meis for a minimum of 30 days, Pesach, as well as somebody who's bringing a korban Pesach, right at the end, a nazir, at the end of this Nazirus, he brings a korban. So, atzitz miratze al tumas adam, v'en atzitz miratze al tumas aguf. So when it comes to a nazir, or a fellow bringing a korban Pesach, the tzitz is miratze for the dam, if they find out that the blood was tameh, so then the tzitz will be miratze. But the tzitz is not miratze for tumas haguf, if they find out that they themselves are tameh. Nidma tumas hatehom, hatzitz miratze. However, if they become tameh, tumas hatehom, which essentially means suffix tumah, so then the tzitz will be miratze. So we say that while if they know for sure that they're tameh, then the tzitz is not miratze. But if they're suffix tumah, the tzitz will be miratze. Let's look at the Gemara. Time de nizrak b'achar kach noda. Now the Gemara wants to make a diuk and say that the Mishnah says that, right, a Pesach she nizrak dam, I'm reading the Mishnah, right, that if the Pesach, the dam was already thrown on the Mizbeach, v'achar kach noda shu tameh, hatzitz miratze. And then after the fact he finds out that he's tameh, or no, that the blood or the meat is tameh, so then the tzitz is miratze. The implication being, as the Gemara says, time at the nizrak, that the reason why the tzitz is miratze is because the blood was already thrown on the mizbeach by the time he found out that it was tameh. However, if he already knew that the blood or the basar was tameh, and then afterwards he did the zrikas adam, lo miratze, the tzitz would not be miratze. Sorry if you hear some noise in the background. It sounds like somebody's snow blowing the snow. So sorry about that, but maybe you won't hear it so much. Just me. It's not too bad though. Okay, so we have a kasha. So we just said on the one hand that if you already knew that the blood or the meat was tameh before the zrikas adam, so then the tzitz would not be miratze. So but we have a contradiction. Hama tzitz miratze. And what is the tzitz miratze? Al adam ve'al basar ve'al chelev. The blood, the meat, and the fats. Shenitma bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid. Bein ba'ones bein b'ratzon. Now, the assumption for now is that when it says shenitma, it means that the zrikas hadam was done bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid bein ba'ones bein b'ratzon. Right? That the tzitz is miratze for the zrikas hadam, whether it was done by accident or intentionally, right, or forced, but usually bein bonus bein baratzon basically means very similar to shogeg and mezid, slightly different. Bein b'yachad bein b'tzibor, whether it is for an individual or whether it is for the congregation. So what do we see? So we want to assume that what that means is that if the zrikas adam was done, whether by accident or on purpose, the tzitz is still going to be miratze. So on the one hand, we wanted to say that the implication of our Mishnah is that only if you found out after the zrikas adam that it was tameh, will the tzitz be miratze. But if you knew at the time that you did the zrikas adam that it was already tameh, the tzitz would not be miratze. Yet we have a brayso that seems to be saying, or at least that we want to understand it to mean, that that even if you did the zrikas adam intentionally, knowing that it's tameh, still the tzitz would be miratze. So Ravina tumaso ben b'shogeg ben b'mezid hurtza. So Ravina explains it to mean that no. What does it mean ben b'shogeg ben b'mezid? If the tumah itself is b'shogeg or b'mezid, kilu, if the meat or the blood became tameh ben b'shogeg ben b'mezid, then the tzitz is going to be miratze. But zrikaso b'shogeg hurtza b'mezid lo hurtza. When it comes to the zrikas adam itself, that would have to be b'shogeg in order for it to work. If you did it b'mezid, it would not work like we see in our Mishnah. Reb Shila Amar, says Reb Shila, zrikaso ben b'shogeg ben b'mezid hurtza. Oh, so Reb Shila Taka says, like we want to, like we wanted to understand the brayso, that if the zrikas adam was done ben b'shogeg ben b'mezid, Taka, it's going to work, right? So even if at the time that you did the zrikas adam, you knew that the blood was already tameh, it still would be okay. Tumaso b'shogeg hurtza b'mezid lahurtza. But when it comes to the tumah of how did the dam become tameh, so then Taka, if it became tameh b'shogeg, so then it works. But if it became tameh b'mezid, so it would not be okay. And therefore, when the brayso says that if the dam or the basar became, or the chelev became tameh bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid, you have to understand it in the following way. Nitma b'shogeg, right? If the dam or the basar or the chelev became tamei b'shogeg, v'zarko, and then you did zrikas hadam bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid, whether you did the zrikas hadam b'shogeg or b'mezid, so then hurtza, then it's still okay. But the katani dam shenizrak v'chakach noda, and then. So what about the Mishnah? Our Mishnah says that Davka, if you already threw the dam on the mizbeach and then you found out that the dam was tamei, implying that if you found out that the dam was tamei before you threw it on the mizbeach, it sounds like it would be a problem. So taima denizrak v'chakach noda, right? So it sounds like that it's only okay because you already did the zrikas hadam before you found out that it was tamei. Aval noda v'chakach nizrak, but if you first knew that the dam was tamei and then you did the zrikas hadam, low, so then that would not be okay. So Rav Shila answers, no, hu adin da'afilu noda v'achakach nizrak. No, really, the same would apply even if you already knew that the dam was tamei at the time that you did the zrikas hadam, and then you did the zrikas hadam b'mezid. That would still be okay. By the katani nizrak v'achakach noda, then how come the Mishnah says it in the reverse order? How come the Mishnah seems to specifically be saying when you already did the zrikas hadam and then found out that the dam was tamei? So Mishum Debai Lemisnei Seifa, well, because the Seifa, right, if we continue reading in the Mishnah, what does it say? Nitma Aguf Ena Tzitz Meratze. Well, if you yourself become Tamei, well then the tzitz will not be Meratze. Dafilu Nizak V'acharkach Noda Lo. That even if you had already done the zrikas hadam and then you found out that you yourself were tamei, still it does not work. But when it comes to the blood, right? So reisha nami nizak v'chakach noda. So therefore it says specifically. So it says in the reisha when it comes to the blood that if you already did zrikas hadam and then you found out that the dam was tamei, so then it's okay. But the truth of the matter is that it would even be okay if you first found out and then did the zrikas hadam. They only said it in that order for consistency with the seifa when you yourself are tamei. Continues the Gemara, nitma tumas hatahom v'chule. Okay, now what happens when you get safek tumah, right? So we said that by Nazir and by Korban Pesach, if the fellow himself is tamei, so then it will be a problem. Right? If the fellow himself is tamei, so then it's a problem. But tumas hatahom, if it is safek tumah, so then we said that it is okay by Korban Pesach and by Nazir. Now, by Ram Brachama asked the kasha, Kohen amratze b'korban oseid. When you have the Kohen who is doing the service, right? So you have the fellow brings his Korban Pesach, or the Nazir brings his Korbanos, and then you have the Kohen who's doing the service. So huchelo tumas hatahom olo. What about him? We said that tumas hatahom, safek tumah, is okay for the Nazir or for the person bringing his Korban Pesach. What about for the Kohen? What if he has safek tumah? Would that be okay? Mi'aminon ki gemire tumas hatahom b'bailim b'kohen de lo gemire. Do we say that tumas hatahom is okay only for the Nazir or the person bringing his Korban Pesach, but not for the Kohen? Odima bezivcha gemire. Or maybe it's not about the individual, it's not about the person bringing the Korban Pesach or the Nazir or the Kohen for that matter. It's about the Korban. Loshna b'kohen v'loshna b'bailim. And therefore it doesn't matter if we're talking about the person bringing the Korban Pesach or the Nazir or the Kohen. Anybody involved in the Korban would if they were tamei tumas hatahom, it would be okay. So that's the kasha, right? When we say that tumas hatahom is okay for a Nazir or a person bringing Korban Pesach, what about the Kohen? Can he also be tamei tumas hatahom, safek tumah? Amar Rava Tashma. Rava says, well, let's try to figure it out. The Tani Reb Chia, that we have a brisa that Reb Chia taught. Lo amru tumas hatahom ela lemeis bil vad. Okay, Reb Chia taught that when we say that tumas hatahom is acceptable, that is only tumas hatahom of a mace. If it's safek tumas hames. Okay, now we have to figure out safek tumas hames. Okay, so what would be an example of some other safek tumah that would not be okay? So lemute mai. So the Gemara says, okay, so what's it excluding? Lav lemute tumas hatahom de sheretz. Well, is it not coming to say tumas hatahom of a sheretz? Meaning we're saying that tumas hatahom, safek tumah of a mace is okay, but safek tumah of a sheretz would not be okay. Uvmayaskin, and what are we talking about? Inema bebailim. If we're talking about, if we're saying that tumas hasheretz right? Suffix tumas sheretz is going to be a problem. And if we're saying it's talking about the bringers of the Kohen, of the Korban, uviman, and which bringer of the Korban are we talking about? Ibn Nazir. If we're saying that it's talking about a Nazir, okay, so we're saying that suffix tumas hames is okay by a Nazir, but suffix tumas sheretz would be a problem. He wouldn't be able to bring his Korban. Mimahanebe. Does tumas sheretz make any difference when it comes to a Nazir? Kiyamuz meis alav amrachmana. What's important when it comes to a Nazir is a dead body. That's the issue. A Nazir can't come in contact with tumas hames. Tumas sheretz, that's not necessarily going to mess anything up. So and that's even tumas sheretz vadai. Kavachomer, suffix tumas sheretz isn't going to mess anything up for the Nazir. So elabosa pesach. Okay, what about the person himself, the owner of the Korban Pesach? Maybe suffix tumas sheretz will be a problem there. Well, okay, well, maybe there's something to talk about if you hold like the Manda Amru who says that you're not allowed to shech the Korban Pesach for somebody who's tamei tumas sheretz. But Manda Amru shochtem v'zokin al tamei sheretz. But what about according to the Manda Amru who says that we do shchita and zrika for somebody who's vadai tamei tumas sheretz when it comes to Korban Pesach? Hashta tumi yadua uchulo tumas tom lo kol sheken. Well, if he knows for sure that he's tamei tumas sheretz, and we're still saying that he's allowed to bring a Korban Pesach according to that Mandam who says that he's allowed to even if he's tamei tumas sheretz, well then certainly if it's a suffix, if we're not sure if he's maybe tamei tumas sheretz, certainly it would make sense to say that he could bring the Korban Pesach. So elah b'kohen. So rather, what it must be, says Rava, it must be talking about the Kohen, and it's saying that, right? Ushmamina hutrilo tumas atom. And what do we seem to be saying? That when it comes to the Kohen, if he's tamei tumas atahom of a mace, so then it's okay. Meaning, if you have a fellow who's bringing he's a nazir and he's bringing his korbanos, or he's bringing a korban pesach, and we're saying that if the kohen who's doing the avoda is tamei suffix tumas hames, that would be okay. But if he's tamei suffix tumas hasheretz, that would not be okay. So we see that the kohen who's doing the avoda would be allowed to be tamei tumas suffix of tumas hames, tumas atahom. Amr of Yosef says of Yosef, lo olam b'bailim. Really, it is talking about the owners. Okay. Uvi Pesach, and it's specifically talking about Korban Pesach. V'lmutei tumas atom de ziva. So it's not talking about tumas sheretz. It's talking about tumas ziva. Meaning, so if it's saying that by Korban Pesach, if the owner is tamei suffix tumas hames, that would be okay. But if he's tamei suffix tumas hazav, so then that would not be okay. But in terms of the Kohen, I don't know. We don't know. I mean, maybe we can argue that it would not be okay. All right. Well, that was Daf Pei of Masechta Pesachim. How'd you guys like Daf Pei? I feel like it wasn't as crazy as the more recent Dafs, which have been somewhat difficult. So what do we talk about? We talk about different configurations of tumah. We talked about what happens when it's Am Yisrael is 50% tamei, 50% tar. We had the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Masya, who said that there would have to be a majority of one is not enough to tip the scale. It would have to be a majority of two. Okay? Reb Shimon says if one shevet in Am Yisrael is tamei, well then they do the Korban Pesach b'tumah, the rest of Am Yisrael does a b'tara. Reb Yehuda says that if one shevet is tamei, then it's considered like 50% of Am Yisrael is tamei, and at 50% already we would do the Korban Pesach b'tumah because we don't want to have a Korban Sibur chaluk, a divisive Korban Sibur where some people are doing a b'tumah and some people are doing a b'tara. We then got to the discussion about Zrikas Adam B'tumah in a new Mishnah, that the implication of the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah says that if you do Zrikas Adam and then you find out that the Dam or the Korban is Tameh, so then it would be okay. Now the Gemara wanted to say, what about if you found out before? Right. What if you found out before the Zrikas Adam that the Dam or the basar was tamei, and then you did the zrikas adam anyways, b'mezid. So Ravina says that that would not be okay. That would not be okay. If we have a brisa which says that if you do the zrikas adam, if you do it bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, it would be okay. So Ravina explains that that's talking about if the dam or the meat became tamei, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, it would be okay. But the zrikas adam has to be b'shogeg, like in our Mishnah, whereas Rav Shila says no, the Zrikas Adam can be bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, and that brisa which says, in our Mishnah, meaning when we say that only b'shogeg it's okay, b'mezid it's not okay. I mean, that's talking about if the dam or the basar became tamei b'shogeg, it would be okay, but b'mezid it would not be okay. And then we talk about tumas atehom, suffix tumah. And the question is, so we say that when it comes to somebody bringing a korban Pesach or somebody bringing a korban as at the end of his Nazirus, so if tumas atahom, if you have suffik tumah, that would be okay. And the question is, how does that apply to the Kohen who's doing the avodah? What if he has suffik tumah? So Rava wanted to answer that question by saying, well, based on Reb Chia, who says that tumas atahom, we're specifically talking about suffik tumas hameis, Rava wanted to say, well, then that implies that suffik tumas sheretz would be a problem, and that would only be a problem if we're talking about the Kohen. So therefore, we're saying that tumas atahom is permitted for a Kohen, just not if it's suffik tumas of sheretz. And Rabbi Yosef says, no, it's actually talking about the owners, and what it's saying is that, yeah, suffik tumas hameis is permitted, but suffik tumas ziva is not permitted, but we don't necessarily know what the halacha would be by a Kohen. That was Daf Pei. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.